I want us to go this morning to the book of Jonah. And we're going to look at the life of Jonah. We're going to compare him to Jesus. And we're going to see some ways that Jonah and Jesus are alike and some ways that are different. And we're going to realize that the core message of Jonah is that Jesus is the only solution for a lost world. I want to read the first 6 verses of the book of Jonah. But really, this sermon's going to be a lot different than most sermons we all enjoy. We're going to be going fast through Scripture. So we're going to look at the entire book of Jonah. We're going to look at some verses in the New Testament, and so we'll be moving fast. But here we'll read 6. Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. Now the word of Yahweh came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. Yet Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh. So he went down to Joppa, found a ship which was going to Tarshish, and paid its fare, and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh. But Yahweh hurled a great wind on the sea, and there was a great storm on the sea, so that the ship gave thought to breaking apart. Then the sailors became fearful, and every man cried to his God, and they hurled the cargo which was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down below into the innermost part of the vessel, lain down, and fallen asleep, deep asleep. So the captain came near to him and said to him, How is it that you are deeply sleeping? Arise, call on your God. Perhaps your God will be concerned about us, so that we will not perish. So let's look at this, and I'm going to remind us all of some of the details here and in the rest of the book of Jonah that we all know. Or at least if those of us that have spent any kind of time growing up in the church or hearing this story in Sunday school probably will remember most of what I'm going to say now. But I need to remind you about it, and then we're going to go to the New Testament, and you'll understand why. First, what was God's command to Jonah? The first part of his command, arise. It's that simple. Get up. And so the interesting thing then, in verse 3, it says that Jonah arose. And I think as a good reader, we're supposed to say, yes, I see God's prophet doing what God said for him to do. Then a couple words later, we realize, and we're let down. Jonah got up, but not to obey God. He got up to go in the opposite direction. He got up and went to Joppa. In fact, look at how it says it. He got up and went down to Joppa. So this up idea was really short-lived. He went up, and then he went down 3 times. You see that? Down to Joppa, down to get into a ship, and then it says later he went down into the innermost part of the ship. So he's not really following through on this command that God had given him. And then he wants to go with the mariners, it says, with the sailors, not with God. And then God sends a wind, a tempest, and the ship is in danger. These sailors were afraid. They certainly had seen storms before, but this one must have been a bit beyond your normal storm, because they started crying out to their gods, to their false gods, crying out for their gods to save them. Where was Jonah? He was asleep in the most bottom part of that boat that he could find, apparently, and it seems like he didn't even care about life anymore. His rebellion against God had given him nothing more than a desire to die. I think that's why he was able to sleep in a life-threatening situation. The captain came to Jonah and he says, "What are you doing? How can you sleep at a time like this?" And what does he say? Look at his word. Arise. This pagan captain agrees with God about what Jonah should be doing. Get up. But and he also inadvertently expresses hope in the power of Yahweh to save them. He says, maybe your God can keep us from perishing. In fact, all of these sailors are showing more faith than Jonah. Up to this point, Jonah had not had said one word to God. But the sailors are praying to their gods, and they cast lots. What does that mean? What's cast lots? It's like throwing dice. You and I think, because we live in a modern world, we think, oh, dice, that's this chance, random chance kind of thing. But these sailors had a spiritual mindset, even though they were totally wrong about who God was. To them, casting lots was to try and get a divine opinion about something. So they're more spiritually sensitive than the true prophet of God. And when they learn that Jonah's running from a God, they get even more afraid. And they don't want to throw, when it's time, they don't want to throw Jonah into the water. They do all they can to avoid it. And in verses 14 and 16, they even end up praying directly to Yahweh, to the true God, and offering him sacrifices. So I think we're supposed to read this and see, on the one hand, there's Jonah, who's a prophet of God, who's failing totally with regard to his relationship to God. And then these people that don't even know who God is are doing everything right. When Jonah tells them to throw him into the sea, what do you think he expected? Have you ever asked yourself that? Jonah's like, oh yeah, they'll throw me in the sea and there's going to be a big fish down there that's going to eat me and save me. That's preposterous. He couldn't have thought that. I think he wanted to die. That's how discouraged he was and how angry he was at God. And when they did throw him into the sea, it turns out that his prediction, what he had said about that's the way to save yourselves, turned out to be true. They threw him into the sea and everything grew calm, it says. It stopped. And the sailors were all saved. Now, we could pause here and say, for the first time in this story, Jonah did something that was good. He accomplished something good. Couldn't we? Kinda? Or maybe we should say, in spite of who Jonah was and what Jonah did, God accomplished something. Because Jonah gives them this ridiculous thing to carry out, and it turns out to save all the sailors at that point. So through the decision of Jonah, the prophet of God was able to do something good for the sailors. How much more could God have done if Jonah would only have been a faithful prophet? Right? Jonah was in the belly of the fish, as you know, for 3 days and 3 nights. And then when he finally got out, chapter 3, verses 2 and 4 tell us he arose and went to Nineveh. So now he's finally obeying God's command. He gets up, he goes to Nineveh like God said. It seems like, oh, good. The prophet's doing the right thing. But when he gets to Nineveh, he preaches, but his sermon is only, in Hebrew, it's only 5 words. In 40 days, Nineveh is going to be destroyed. Do you imagine that this 5-word sermon was what God had in mind for Nineveh? Why would God even tell him to go there if it's just, yep, you guys are toast in 40 days? That's all. I think God wanted more. But Jonah was being Jonah again. What happened as a result? The entire city repented. Is that because this 5-word sermon was really, really good? No, of course not. Once again, God did great things in spite of Jonah's failures. And God saved the city of Nineveh. How much more could God have done, God have done, if Jonah had been the right kind of prophet? So, when we look at a story like Jonah, what's the best way that we can apply it to our lives? There's one way that we can apply it to our lives that's not bad, but it's not the best. When we look at the story of Jonah, we can ask ourselves, how much more could God do through me if I just learned to correct Jonah's mistakes? We can notice what he did wrong, and we say, okay, that's where I need to be different. And that's good. It's not bad, but it's not the best. I think there's a better way to take this passage. Let's go to the New Testament. In the New Testament, we're going to find it's not about me. It's not about you being the best Jonah that we can be. In the New Testament, we find there's already a perfect Jonah. He already came, and he already fixed all of those mistakes. Think with me about the life of Jesus. We're going to end up at Matthew chapter 8. But I want to share a couple other verses before we get there. John 3:13 says, "No one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man." Do you notice that? Also, in the life of Jesus, we've got somebody that goes up and goes down. A little bit like Jonah. Not enough to say, that verse by itself, we can't say, oh, this is intentionally comparing Jesus to Jonah. But you're going to see there's some intentionality here based on the preponderance of evidence as we take everything together. Philippians 2:6-7 says that Jesus was in the form of God, But he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, rather emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Just as Jonah fled from God, Jesus distanced himself from his Father. Interesting, isn't it? You wouldn't think that Jesus could be compared to that failure in Jonah's life. In Jesus' case, it wasn't a failure. It was out of his love for you and me that he went away from God. Matthew 1, verse 23, tells us, a familiar verse, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. If you look at that word, Emmanuel, you compare it to one of the words in the story of Jonah, when it says, "with them," it's almost the same. Immanuchem in Jonah, Emmanuel in Matthew. Jonah wanted to go with the sailors, and Jesus is God with us. Now, go with me to Mark chapter 8. And here's where it gets really, really cool. In Mark chapter 8, the author of this book is intentionally showing us who Jesus is. Matthew wants us to see that Jesus is the perfect Jonah, who's going to fix all the mistakes that Jonah made. Let me show you. Mark 8, verse 24. Actually, let me just read Mark 8, 23 to 27 to start with. "And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves. But Jesus himself was sleeping. And they came to him and got him up, saying, 'Save us, Lord, we are perishing.' And he said to them, 'Why are you so cowardly, you men of little faith?' Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. And the men marveled and said, 'What kind of a man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?'" So let's think about this. Once again, we've got wind, tempest, and danger to the boat. Once again, we've got the main character asleep in the boat in the middle of a storm. Jonah was asleep because, like I said, I think he did not even care for his own life or anybody else's at that point. Jesus was asleep, not because of that kind of bad attitude. Rather, Jesus had such perfect trust in his Father and his protection that he could sleep in any situation. And just like the captain went to Jonah, the sailors in Jesus' time, the disciples, go to Jesus and they say, "We're perishing. Help us." Jesus arose, he uses that term, he arose, just like the captain told Jonah to rise. And Jesus spoke. Nothing else. He spoke. There's a difference there, isn't it? What does Jonah do? "Throw me into the water. Kill me. I don't care. I'll die to save you guys." Wait a second. Does that sound a little familiar in the life of Jesus? Jesus did not die at that moment, did he? But later, he did give his life. He was also willing to die for different reasons than Jonah. Philippians 2:8 tells us, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Unlike Jonah, all Jesus had to do was speak, and there was a great calm. So Jesus is showing he's like Jonah, and yet he's even more powerful. What do you think Jesus would say about all this? Do you think Jesus knew that he was being like Jonah? Actually, look what he said about himself in Matthew 12:40. Jesus says, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish," oh wait, is there another comparison here? "So will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." So Jesus knew it. Like Jesus is saying, I'm Jonah, and I'm fixing the mistakes of Jonah. I'm going to get it right, and that's going to make all the difference. In Jonah's case, even with failures, God was able to save the entire city. In Jesus' case, God's able to save the entire world. John 3:16, tells us that God did this so that the entire world might be saved through him. So God used Jonah in spite of his mistakes. And we might do well to figure out how to correct those mistakes in our life. But we'll do way better realizing God used Jesus much more than Jonah, and to a much greater extent than he can use you and I. Jesus' work greatly surpasses that of Jonah. Remember, Jonah didn't even care about himself or others. Jesus' ministry was characterized by constant compassion. Matthew 9:36 tells us, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Should we try to correct the mistakes of Jonah in our lives? Yeah, let's do it. But let's not let that be our main focus. What's our main focus? We need to take Jesus and show him to a world that's lost. We show Jesus through our lives and through Scripture, and sharing in any way the good news of what Jesus already accomplished and what we can't do, because you and I are going to fail like Jonah. That's just the reality of it. If not in exactly the same ways, we're going to fail in similar ways or worse. And we need to show them the perfect prophet who offers salvation to the entire world. To catch this truth fully, we need the whole Bible, right? We need the Old Testament and we need the New Testament. If we only have part of the Bible, we only have part of the picture. If we just take the Old Testament, we're pretty likely to miss Jesus, right? We're just like, oh, Jonah was bad. Let's see if we can be better. And we miss the whole point. If we only have the New Testament, we've got Jesus, but we don't really catch his full glory. We don't realize, wow, this is what Jesus is able to correct that was so wrong before he came. Let's commit ourselves to studying the entire Bible and to see the big picture of how Jesus fixes all that was wrong in this world, all that's wrong in our lives, and see all that he offers for a world that needs him.